Somebody missed it. Hey friends out on the internet, we're doing Punnett squares today. And in case you couldn't tell, I got a busted lip. Was chopping some firewood last night, and you see that right there? Well, busted out my teeth. Hurt like a mother. Anyway, my mouth's still swollen. Oh well, so that's the way it goes sometimes. So we're doing this Punnett square from, we ended on yesterday. They were supposed to do for homework. We're gonna go through and do this. So you do all the possible combinations when you're looking for these. So big T, or little t, big Y, little t, little y, little t, big Y, little t, little y. Okay, now up top, same thing. All the possible combinations. Big T, big Y, big T, little y. Little t, big Y, little t, little y. So, all you have to do is go through and fill them out, put them out together. So put the like letters together, dominant letter first, and you'll go through and fill all of those in like that. Now, to save us a little bit of time today, if y'all need to pause it and practice this, you can. We're gonna go ahead and go over the answers. So, how many different genotypes did you guys get? Walker, how many did you get?
A lot.
How many did you get, Katie? Y'all can't count the different genotypes? Did y'all list them out? Did y'all do the genotypic and phenotypic ratios? Did anybody do that besides Mason? Those people on this side of the room. Sarah, how many did you get?
6.
Okay, 6. Mason, you got 6. You get 6, Ashlyn? What about you? You the man, Matt. All right, so what are our 6 genotypes, Sarah?
Big T, little t, big Y, big
Hold on, pop them brakes. Big T, little t, big Y.
big Y.
Okay.
Big T, little t, big Y, little y. Big T, little y, little y. Little t, and big Y, little t, big Y, little y, and little t, little y, little y.
All right, pretty much every combination you can think of, right? So, now that we have that, what is our, how many of these did you have? 2? These?
4.
How many?
4.
These guys?
2.
These guys?
2, 3.
These guys?
4.
These guys?
2.
Okay, so that's our genotypic ratio. Just listing them out, you could reduce that down, but that's a genotypic ratio. Now, how many different phenotypes did you wind up with, Matt? Remember, phenotype is the physical appearance, the way it looks. Is that what you got, Mason?
I did the phenotype.
Who did the phenotype?
4.
You got 4? Okay, so once you get the genotype, the phenotype should be really easy. So, for instance here, let me move you guys over. Remember, phenotype is just the physical appearance. So, can y'all see that? Yeah. Okay. So, these guys up here are going to have the same phenotype. They're going to be what and what? They're going to be tall and yellow. We don't say big, Katie. It's a body shaming word. Tall and yellow. Black and yellow, black and yellow. Any gangster rappers out there? Never mind. So, all of these are going to be tall and they're going to be yellow because they got that dominant trait. These guys right here are going to be tall and green. Thanks for your participation, my bad. These guys right here are all going to be what? Short and yellow. And these guys are going to be short and green. Okay, and then you can add them up pretty easily. You know you've got 6 up here, you've got 2 of these, you got 6 of these, you got 2 of these. So that's going to give you your phenotypic ratio. Okay? Any questions on that? It's likely that you see at least one dihybrid cross on a quiz or test. So I want to make sure that you know how to work your way through it and then what you're looking for in terms of genotypic and phenotypic ratios. Okay? So now that we talked about that, let's do another math concept here that we haven't discussed before. I'm going to erase this real quick, and let's talk about, what's that thing at the end of number 1, the probability, what does it say? What? Rules of multiplication. Okay. We are not going to do any trihybrid crosses. I don't have enough time for that. But we are going to figure out the probability of an offspring with multiple genes. When I say multiple, you can do this for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, how many ever you want to. And it's pretty simple, an easy way of doing those rules of multiplication. So let me give you an example. Let's say you have a parent that has big A, big B, little b, and big C, little c. So let's go say that's mom. And then dad, let's say that dad is little a, big B, and little c. Okay? So here's what I want to know. What is the likelihood that those two parents will have offspring that are big A, big B, big C, little c? Okay? So what is the probability that these two parents will have an offspring with these traits? Now, can you do this without doing a Punnett square? Yes. Can you do it without doing a Punnett square? So I'm going to give you a second, see if you can figure it out, and then we'll come back and we'll work it. What's up, friends? If you're like all the students in my class, you have no idea how to do this. So we're going to teach you. So here's mom, here's dad, here's the offspring. What's the likelihood that these two parents will make this offspring? So what is our probability? Okay. So what you're going to do is you're going to treat each one of these like a Punnett square. Okay. Now you could make a Punnett square. I think that if you wanted to, so like you could do big A, have a square, little a, and then you could figure out like what's the probability they're going to have a big A, little a. And it's probably pretty easy to look at. All of these are going to be big A, little a. So out of 4, that would be 4 out of 4, or 1, okay? So you can also do it, I mean, you can do a Punnett square each time if you want to, but you can just look at them and say, let's see, what's the likelihood we're going to wind up with a big B, little b? Well, that 2 crosses isn't going to be big B, little b, but that one would. And then these 2 cross, that would be 1, and that's going to give us little b, little b. So there's how many out of 4 right there are going to be big B, little b? 2. And then we're looking for big C, little c. There's a big C, little c. There's a big C, little c, but not there and not there. So that's going to be another 2 out of 4. And so when you multiply those out, the probability that that offspring is going to have those traits from those parents is going to be, it may be easier if you reduce. 1/2 times 1/2 times 1 is, y'all know how to multiply fractions, right? 1/4. We have a 25% chance of having an offspring with these traits. Any questions? So now I've got another one for you, another practice. Y'all go through and work this one, and then we'll see if we can. Hold on, you can't see that, can you? Here we go. So here's mom, here's dad, here's the offspring. See if you guys can work that one out. Okay, friends, we're back. Let's try this out. So to get big A, little a, there's 1, there's 2. So we've got a 2 out of 4 chance with those genes. With these offspring, you're going to have big B, little b. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So all of those are going to be big B, little b. So that's a 4 out of 4. And then big C, big C. 1, 2, those don't work. So we've only got 2 out of 4. So the probability this offspring will come from these two parents is 1 out of 4. Good. Multiply that, reduce it, you get 1/4 or 25%. Any questions? I've got a worksheet for this. I will probably work on one day next week when we're preparing and getting ready for the test. But until then, let's work on part 3 of Mendelian genetics notes. Now, part 3, we're getting into pedigrees. So, from those of you who were in my class, we did a gel electrophoresis lab about a week and a half ago. And in that lab, you guys had to come up with a pedigree, correct? For a family, and you were looking at a gene for cancer that was being passed on. So you had to identify that and see if you could identify where it was passed on and how it was passed on. Here's some homework for you to think about. This weekend, I want you to make a family tree. And we're not going to do a pedigree for one particular trait, but here's what I want you to do. I want you to go back as many generations as you can, probably at least to your great-grandparents. Now, I'm under the assumption that if you know your parents, that they know their grandparents. So that means at least your great-grandparents, right? And then any aunts or uncles that you want to add in there that can shoot off of that. Now, that familysearch.org website that I told you about the other day, y'all can fill that in and work on that if you really wanted to do that and share with your family. But you don't have to. But anyway, you're going to make a family tree. I want you to go in, and as many of those people that you know that have some type of genetic related disorder or problem, I want you to write it in beside their name. And so essentially what you're doing is you're figuring out if there's any traits of disorders or inherited problems that are passed throughout your family. Things that you may want to look for when you guys get older. Things that you may want to look for in your parents as they're getting older. So, maybe there's, you see some type of cancer, like breast cancer or colon cancer in one side of the family. And then you're like, well, that's on mom's side of the family. Maybe she needs to go get a colonoscopy. Maybe she needs to get checked out. Something to think about, Walker. Or let's say you got breast cancer on your side of the family, Mason, and then like an aunt, maybe a grandma, and you're like, Dad, maybe you need to get checked to see if you've got breast cancer because it runs in our genes. Did you know that 1 in 100 breast cancers are in men? That's right. Did I tell you about the time I thought I had breast cancer? We won't get into that right now on the internet. So anyway, true story. So don't forget that by Friday night, you've got a quiz on meiosis that you need to take on AP Classroom. Is anybody taking that? Was it long?
No.
Was it hard?
It was like 14 questions.
Was it hard?
Very easy.
Okay, good. I think if you paid attention and you can use your notes if you want to. If you want to go back and use them to help you, then that's okay. I would try to take them first without it. And then after first of next week, I'll open it up where you can go back in and look and see the ones you missed. And it has some explanations about why they're answered the way they are. So anyway, the other things, chickens. We are planning on incubating chickens probably next Wednesday, a week from today. So if you think that your parents are going to let you have baby chickens and that you can accommodate them, then you need to make sure that let me know that by Monday, okay? Because I've got to get enough eggs together to put in the incubator for the people that want some. And my wife really wants some copper Moran chickens, and Miss Uptain is going to bring us some eggs, so we're going to hatch along with them. She's tickled about that. So we'll see how that goes. For all of you in internet land, y'all get to see us incubate and raise chickens. That means they'll hatch out about the 3rd of March, and we'll have them for about a week and a half before spring break. And that day before spring break, you guys, if you get one or whoever gets one, they can take them home. Now, pedigrees. So a pedigree, you normally think of like a pedigree dog or the dog food, right? Because a lot of dogs, what does it mean to your pedigree, typically in just like normal vernacular? When they say it has a good pedigree, so-and-so has a good pedigree. That puppy's got a good pedigree. You ever heard that? Y'all need to read more or watch more TV like I do. Pedigree usually means like your breeding, where you came from. And so in this instance in bio, it's similar. And so when we do pedigrees, we're looking at how certain traits are passed from parents to offspring. And we've got a couple here on this page for those of you at home that can see them. And here's what I want you guys to do. Without really reading into the paragraph, just by looking at the picture, the one on top, it talks about a widow's peak. Okay? So a widow's peak is if you pull back your hair and you got a little point right here, comes across. I think mine's just like that from receding hairline. Some of y'all may have that out there. So if that comes to a point like that, that's a widow's peak. Now, just by looking at the picture, here's some things you need to know about pedigrees. The squares are men, because men are like square shaped or rectangles. And then the girls are curvy. They're like circles. Good. Now, I didn't make these rules up. This is just the way pedigrees are. That's an easy way to remember it. So, you can see when they have a baby, they're hooked together, and then their offspring are posted below them. Now, in this case, the purple is showing the trait. It could be a disorder. It could be a trait like this where it's just widow's peaks. And if you look there in the chart, you'll notice that girl on the bottom right. Does she have a widow's peak? No. So her chart isn't colored in. But what do we notice about her parents? They both have a widow's peak. She doesn't have a widow's peak. So what does that tell us about what type of trait it is?
It's recessive.
It's a recessive trait? They've both got it, but she doesn't? If you have a recessive trait, how many alleles for that gene do you have to have?
2.
You got to have both of them, right? In order to have a recessive disorder, disease, trait, whatever, you've got to inherit both of that from both of your parents. So both of these parents have widow's peaks, but one of their kids doesn't have a widow's peak. So could it be a recessive trait?
No.
No, not at all. So that means it has to be a dominant trait. So it's a dominant trait, and then she inherited both recessive non-widow's peaks, and so that's how she didn't have a widow's peak. Okay, so that's how a pedigree would look like, what you would look out for if you were determining, is this a dominant trait or a recessive trait? Okay, if you've got parents that have something and then the offspring don't, then that is a good sign that it is a dominant trait. Okay, now, on the bottom one, same thing. Don't look at the paragraph, just look at the picture. You've got attached earlobes and free earlobes. So most of us have free earlobes. Some of y'all may have attached. And to be honest with you, there's a little more complexity to the whole deal than this is right here. But for simplification purposes, you can look at it and see. All right. So the girl on the bottom left, she has attached earlobes. We want to know if this is a dominant or recessive trait. Now, just by looking at her parents, do her parents have attached earlobes? No. Her parents don't have attached earlobes, but she does. So that tells us it's what type of trait? Recessive, because her parents don't have it, but they do have those recessive genes, and it can be passed on to her. Now, could her parents have attached earlobes and she have attached earlobes? Sure, they would just have both genes, though. Good. So, and you could do this for like the cancer gene we looked at in the lab the other day. You can do this for almost any trait that you're looking to see how it's passed on from parent to offspring. Now, tomorrow, we're going to be working on a royal pedigree. So this is from all the inbred jokers running all the royal households in the 17, 18, early 1900s. And in case you didn't know, there's so much inbreeding going on. Everybody had running around with 6 fingers and hemophilia and no telling what else. So we're going to see if we can trace one of these traits through the royal family. Okay. Now, let's talk about, what else was I going to say? Okay, well, let's talk about something else then. Recessive disorders. These are disorders that show up. They're usually very harmful to an organism. A lot of times they show up because of, we just mentioned it, inbreeding. Good. Let's talk about dogs. What kind of dog do you want? What type of dog could you get that's likely to have like a genetic disorder? What? What'd you say, Mason?
I said purebred.
Purebred is correct. Purebreds tend to have more genetic disorders. Why?
Because
They're constantly inbred to maintain certain traits and characteristics. So you have to breed them with some other dog that has a similar trait and characteristic. And when you do so, then you're breeding traits in. And if there's any recessive disorder or problems, then if it's recessive, you might not have it, you might not have it, but y'all have a baby, they might have it because it can be passed on. You've got like a 25% chance of passing that on to your offspring. So it's much more likely to show up, okay? So, if you're looking for a dog that is less likely to have some type of genetic disorder or problem result, what would you look for? Mutt. Why is that, Matthew?
Better not have inbreeding.
Yeah, I mean, remember, in life, the more diversity you have, the better, the more likely there is for survival, and that applies to breeding of animals and people and whatever else. So, let's look at the first one here. The first disorder we're looking at is cystic fibrosis. And what can you tell us about cystic fibrosis, Katie?
I read about it for HOSA. Basically, the person who has it basically drowns to death because
In their own fluid.
Yeah.
Yes. So you'll notice here, Caucasians, about 1 in 25 people are carriers. That's you people of Anglo descent, and even there's a lot of people throughout the world who are from the Caucasus regions, just kind of in Eastern Europe. So even like people from India are considered Caucasians. So anyway, about 1 in 25. So that means in any given classroom, you probably got one person who's a carrier for cystic fibrosis. Affects 1 in 2,500 births, one of the most common lethal genetic diseases. Typically, you die in like your late 30s, early 40s is the average kind of lifespan for most people with cystic fibrosis. There are some newer, better treatments out there, but really the only way to fix a faulty gene like this would be to what?
Like biotechnology.
Yeah, you'd have to use some biotech like CRISPR, where you could go in and cut out that gene and replace it, and that tissue in the lungs. And I'm wondering if we'll ever have the ability to target that many tissues where you can go in and target and replace a gene. Maybe so, hopefully one day. So anyway, now let's say, Mason, that you're doing a pedigree over the weekend and you find out that someone in your family had cystic fibrosis. And 10 years down the road, you go to get married. What's something you might want to do? You would know if you had cystic fibrosis. You wouldn't be able to breathe very well. You'd be on lots of medicines and probably not be at school right now. What? Yes. You'd want to see if your wife has a what?
The gene, the trait.
If she was a carrier. Good. So you would get tested. She would get tested. If you both were carriers, then there would be, a pretty high probability, 25% of you having offspring with cystic fibrosis. So you may want to choose a different option because of that. Now, my wife had some friends growing up in Atlanta, up the street, and their son knew that their family had a history of cystic fibrosis. So when he got married, his wife and him got tested. I want to say he showed up as a carrier, but she didn't. So they're like, hey, we should be able to have kids and it'd be fine. They go to have a kid, guess what? Cystic fibrosis. Apparently her test came back with a false negative. And because of that, they went up with a kid with cystic fibrosis. Now, they love that little girl, and she's okay for the most part, but it is very different raising a kid with cystic fibrosis who you tend to want to isolate more because any type of respiratory disease or illness can be potentially deadly. And as you get older, that fluid, you have to do all these treatments. If you look online, there's a bunch of videos about like people who will post the treatments they do. They have to do all these breathing treatments throughout the day. They have to sit and basically like hit themselves and cough up fluid that's building up in their lungs. And so it's just a really difficult road to have to travel down. And so I think that's why most people probably would avoid, having a kid that have to deal with that. So, but any of you out there, people out there with cystic fibrosis, we salute you. Keep up the good fight. All right, the next one, Tay-Sachs. Now, most of y'all watched Lorenzo's Oil in 9th grade, correct? If you've not seen Lorenzo's Oil, go watch Lorenzo's Oil. It's a true story. It's magical. It's about a little boy who has a genetic disorder. Now, his isn't a recessive disorder, it's a sex-linked disorder. Well, it's sex-linked recessive, but we'll talk about that, meaning it's found on the X. Most of these diseases we're looking at here are all on your autosomes, meaning chromosomes 1 through 22. Okay. So, first one here, Tay-Sachs. Now, this is talked about in your book a little bit. They've got some sections for each one of these. Tay-Sachs. Read part A for us, Walker.
This disorder creates a non-functional lysosome in brain cells. Brain cells need massive amounts of energy to function properly. Therefore, they feed upon lipids primarily. The lysosomes break them down using beta oxidation for use in cellular respiration. The lysosomes associated with this disorder are missing an enzyme to be able to do this, so they just fill up with lipids.
Okay, so let me break that down for you. Your brain needs lots of energy, and a lot of that energy comes from lipids or fats. People with Tay-Sachs don't have the gene to break down those fats. Those fats build up, and the cells fill up with lipids, and then they start to die. Mainly in the Jewish culture. I think there's a specific Jewish group associated with this, but I can't remember the exact name, because of a lot of intermarrying in the culture. And so there's a high percentage of carriers of Tay-Sachs. Children affected usually die a painful blind death by the age of 5, which sounds a lot like who did I just mention? Lorenzo, yes, from Lorenzo's oil. Remember boys with ALD, they couldn't produce an enzyme to break down fats, and it stripped away their myelin sheath, and then they usually by 5 to 7 they died. Do y'all remember that video? Lorenzo's oil? Okay, well, spoiler alert, that's what happened. So very similar in nature and functionality. Now, sickle cell disease. I'm going to say that the note writer here, I do not agree with. I do not think sickle cell should be classified as a recessive disorder. I think it should be classified as a codominant disorder, okay? So, and here's the argument I'm going to lay out for that. And I don't know exactly what this person was thinking, but anyway, we're on 284 in your book. There's a picture of people with sickle cell disease and people with sickle cell trait, which basically means they carry this trait right here at the bottom, and then sickle cell disease at the top. You can see the difference. And so what you wind up with in sickle cell disease. So who has sickle cell?
African American.
Primarily black people of sub-Saharan African descent. So if you look at a map of where people with sickle cell are located, and it's going to basically overlap what other map? Where people are that have malaria. So there's a good picture in the 9th grade book of this. But basically the maps they overlap. And so the highest prevalence is definitely in sub-Saharan Africans, and there's some in people of Middle Eastern descent, and some Indian, and some Hispanic, but the numbers are much less. I want to say the number of sickle cell carriers or with sickle cell trait is close to 1 in 10 if you're black. So it's a pretty high number, okay? And so if you look there, remember, you've got these sickle cells, which is caused by your blood cells are sickle-shaped. Why?
It's hard to
Changing
malaria.
protein structure.
It's not for malaria. That's just kind of a byproduct. Why do they look like that?
It's
What?
a change in protein structure.
Why is the protein structure changed?
Because of the DNA is changed.
What in the DNA changed? Y'all remember?
The gene,
Which gene?
is it the U?
Gene for hemoglobin, excuse me. And if you look in your notes there, it says the 6 amino acid, so it's the 6 one down, changed. One letter changed, which changed the amino acid from glutine to valine. Okay. So that change in that amino acid caused the protein, your hemoglobin, to fold differently, which caused the proteins that hook together to make blood cells to fold, and it makes these sickle kind of banana-shaped cells instead of a normal round concave cell that's squishy and goes through capillaries very easily. And so a lot of times what results if you have sickle cell disease, you have those cells clot up easier, they don't carry as much oxygen, and you wind up with issues because of that. Now, is sickle cell the mutation? Is it good or is it bad? Katie?
I mean, both.
Okay, give me both. If you have sickle cell disease, we would say it's probably bad. Now, you still have some malaria resistance, but in terms of if you don't get medical treatment a lot of times, then that can prove difficult for you. If you are have sickle cell trait, meaning you have, and this is why I would call it codominant, because you're going to wind up with some normal blood cells and some that are sickle shaped, okay? And because of that, the malaria, the plasmodium, which is a little protist, a little microscopic organism that infects you through the mosquito, when it gets in your body, it's not able to replicate in those sickle cells like it normally would. Now, it can still replicate in some of the other blood cells, but it's not going to take over your body like it normally would. And that's why it gives you some resistance to malaria. Now, that's beneficial. So that's a good thing. And that's why it's so prevalent in many people of black descent, because they're from sub-Saharan Africa where there's lots of malaria. And so if it's beneficial, this will go, there's a whole lesson in our evolution unit on this, but it's beneficial. If a gene, a mutation is beneficial, then it's what's going to happen eventually. It's going to become more and more prevalent as it's passed throughout the population. So there we go. Now there's some drawback and there's some benefit, and so we'll get more into that when we get to evolution. Dominant disorders. Turn to page 285. Now, y'all may have heard of dwarfism, little people. There's about, I think, like 80-something different types of dwarfism. Some are spontaneous mutations. Most people are not dwarfs. The one example is achondroplasia, a form of dwarfism that occurs in 1 in every 25,000 people. So it's a pretty rare condition. Usually don't see people with dwarfism out just because it's so rare. But, so there's a gene that causes this. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to make a Punnett square real quick without looking at the one on the bottom. Don't look at the one in your book. Okay? Hide that one for a second. If you have two people that have a similar type of dwarfism that can be passed on to their offspring, so it's a dominant disorder. We're going to say it's heterozygous dominant, okay? But both the parents are heterozygous dominant for dwarfism. And I want you to tell me the percentage of their offspring that will be dwarfs. What'd you say, Mason?
It would be 75%.
What? 3? That's a percent? 3%? 75? You might got anything else?
25. 17.3%.
50%.
You're gonna run my battery down on my buzzer. All right, let's look at dwarfism. Dwarfism is a unique dominant disorder. You run it like this, so better color here. We'll do big D, little d, big D, little d. Dwarf, 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 normal height. What happened to this kid?
He died.
Let's look at the picture. What does it say? Maybe above the picture. Dominant alleles that cause a lethal disease are much less common. So in this scenario, oftentimes when they inherit both traits, that is going to be a lethal mutation that's passed on. So there's not enough. So whatever the normal DNA is in like the little d that's passed on, there's not enough of that there in order for the child to survive. So I imagine probably what would happen in many cases is like a miscarriage or just the child wouldn't develop early on. Okay, and so that's what you would expect to wind up with. They did a little bit different one in the one in your book, but that's typically what happens in that type of dwarfism. Okay. So now you are correct about that. It would be 75% if you're crossing two heterozygous dominant traits. But in this case, a little bit different. All right, another one is Huntington's disease. This disorder affects 1 in 10,000 births. This actually affects older people, what does it say? In the 40 to 50 range. Family history, slow degenerative disorder affecting the brain that's almost always fatal. Similar in its effect to ALS. It's a degenerative brain disorder that happens really around that time period. But this is inherited. I think we're still kind of the jury's out on ALS, what actually causes it. Somebody out there knows, you can write it in, maybe link the article to it. As far as I've seen, we don't know. But Huntington's disease. Now, so this is another dominant disorder, meaning you would have to have a parent with it. They may not know they had it. Like it may, let's say, your dad has it, you have kids, they get to be in that 40 to 50 year. I'm 40, Lord have mercy. And then they die, and then you're already born, and you're like, oh, I got it. So, I mean, that's really that'd be a harsh thing to find out at that point, right? I guess you'd live life to the fullest. Now, it doesn't always show up, though, okay? So let's skip down to the part where it says penetrance. Penetrance is basically, if you have that disorder, that's dominant disorder like that, how often does it show up? Because you've got a normal gene. In the case of Huntington's disease, it's about 95% of the time. So 5% of the people don't express that Huntington dominant trait for whatever reason. I'm not really sure. It still has one normal allele that's able to express, and the dominant one doesn't. All right. And there are many multifactorial diseases. So these are the kind that you're probably going to find when you are making your family tree and you're listing out, Uncle Jed died from a car accident. Uncle Jack died from a three-wheeler accident. Maybe, I don't know if stupid can be passed on in genes, but somebody got kicked in the head by a cow. Those aren't really what we're counting here. We're counting things that we know that there is a genetic component to it. That didn't happen to you, did it, Walker? Nobody in your family? Okay, good. So, things like heart disease, diabetes, cancer, alcoholism. These things have a known genetic component, but there's also an environmental component. So, let's say, for instance, alcoholism, the last time I heard, there was about 3 genes that were identified that, I don't know if I want to say caused, but help push people toward alcoholism. If you found out you had one of those genes, or maybe even 2 of them, Katie, what do you think you would do?
Stay away from alcohol.
Probably stay away from the alcohol pretty hard, because, yeah, that's a high likelihood that you would develop that type of disease. Cancer. If you knew in your family that you had some type of breast cancer that was prevalent, what do you think you'd go do? Yeah, you'd go talk to your doctor, and they'd probably put you on some program where you're getting a mammogram early, or if there was a type of colon cancer that showed up a lot, you'd be in there knocking on the door trying to get a colonoscopy, or diabetes. I'm sure you'd be more watching out for that to show up in your family. Heart disease, like if you knew somebody in your family had died from a heart attack at 40, then one, it should affect how you eat and exercise, and 2, it's something that you would want to go in and get checked periodically and look out for. I had a friend not too long ago, he's like 44, just normal size guy, probably about normal height, normal weight, and is a little bit tired and wasn't feeling great, kind of lethargic, and he went in and got a stress test done. And this was during COVID, so it was almost a fact where he didn't go in because of COVID when it first started out. And he went in and he was 99% blocked in his widowmaker, as they say. It's the coronary artery that supplies blood to your heart tissue. And if you just looked at this guy, you thought, no way that's ever possible. But it was. So, that's something that you would want to look out for. So these are things, your parents are getting that age where there's a lot of stuff starts to show up. So hopefully those are some things that you can identify and you guys can look out for in your family history. Okay? All right. Anybody have any questions? Good job.